There is a huge amount of misinformation out there about how matchmaking works in Warzone. There's a lot of people telling you that they know how it works and that Activision is doing something super manipulative, super evil, and I just don't think that's right. I think skill-based matchmaking or engagement-optimized matchmaking, whatever it is that's working in Warzone right now, is probably the best solution to an incredibly difficult problem. And in this video, I'll explain exactly why. I'll also address some of those misconceptions and some of the arguments that people have against it, and I'm actually going to back up what I'm saying with a little bit of evidence, with some studies, with some research, because I've done my reading on this so I know what I'm talking about. Do please share your thoughts on Warzone matchmaking in the comments below, let's get a discussion going, but also please watch to the end of the video because I am going to address a lot of common misconceptions, hopefully in a way that might change some of your minds about things. Let's go into this with open minds. So first of all, let's explain the big terms we're going to be talking about here: skill-based matchmaking and engagement-optimized matchmaking. Skill-based matchmaking is a system where you're put up against opponents who have a similar skill level to you. And this isn't something that's just new for Warzone, this is something that's been used in games for a very long time. Some sports or some activities have very specific ways of displaying skill and registering skill. So like in chess, you will have a rating, in golf, you'll have a handicap, but in lots of video games, they actually hide this rating from you to stop people abusing it, to stop people from working out what they can do to get a lower skill rating so they can get put up against easier opponents. A lot of video games use something based on ELO, so this is a skill rating that basically assumes a new player will have a kind of average for new players skill rating, and then if you beat people your skill rating will go up, and if you lose to people your skill rating will go down. The way it also makes this a little bit more interesting is that if you beat someone who is worse than you, so who the system already expected you to beat, your skill rating won't really change. But if you beat someone who you were expected to lose against, so someone who was much better than you, then your skill rating will change quite dramatically. And the opposite is true. So if you lose against someone who was much better than you, it doesn't really make any difference because that was the expected outcome. The skill rating is still probably right. But if you lose to someone who's much worse than you, then your skill rating will go down dramatically because you were doing worse than the system expected you to. So it's readjusting your ELO rating, your skill rating, to be lower. Now, there have been various improvements to that system over time, and like I said, this system is used in everything from like chess to fighting games to real-time strategy games to first-person shooter games. The Geeky system adds in an extra layer to ELO where it considers how reliable your skill rating is. So if you haven't played the game for quite a long time or you don't play very often, then it will consider you more unreliable, so it won't let your score affect other people quite as much as it would someone who it's completely sure where you are. It will give you kind of a range with deviation built into it of where it thinks your skill rating could be, rather than assuming it knows exactly where you are. And if you play more, then that range gets narrower and narrower because the system gets more confident. There's also the true skill system, which lots of team-based video games use, which tries to work out, okay, how good are you with different team compositions, maybe in different roles within a team, and tries to balance out the skill rating of an entire team using something similar to the ELO rating. So a skill-based matchmaking system would try to take on one of those skill ratings, maybe a combination of different types of skill ratings, and then use that to try and match you up against other players who have a similar skill rating to yours. Obviously, this has the benefit of meaning that the matches are quite fair, that you're going to be going up against someone where you've got kind of, in theory, a 50-50 chance of winning against them if this is a 1v1 match, which is what a lot of these studies are based on. Now, SBMM does have some downsides in all places where it's used, like it can lead to games feeling very similar because you're up against other people who play the same way you do, and in games where draws are possible, it will lead more often than not to draws, which are often unsatisfying to people. Engagement optimized matchmaking is something that's used as kind of like a boogeyman in the Warzone community a little bit, where people bring it up saying like this is an example of something bad that's used within the matchmaking system. But I don't think they've taken the time to really understand what it is. And it doesn't take long to understand it. I'll put a link in the description below. But basically, engagement optimized matchmaking was a system put forward by a group of EA workers alongside some university researchers working at UCLA and Northeastern University. And this was only in 2017, so it wasn't that long ago, but they were basically trying to come up with a system for video games that would be better in some way than skill-based matchmaking. So their starting point was to look at churn risk. So this is the idea that after any given game, you've got a certain percentage chance that you will stop playing that game for a period, whether it's you stop playing for 8 hours or for a week or for a year. Obviously, it could be different for different games. And they're trying to work out how to minimize that churn risk, how to stop you from wanting to stop playing, how to keep you engaged for longer, hence it being called engagement optimized matchmaking. They base their data on what they refer to as a popular PvP game made by EA, which is kind of interesting. I don't think it can be Apex Legends because it's talking about a game where there's just one player versus one other player, and draws are a possibility. So I'm not really sure what it is. Let me know in the comments if you think you know what the game is that they were basing this data on. But they weren't doing this just off gut feeling. They were doing this based on a lot of real data from a real video game. One of the first interesting things in the paper, and like I said, the paper is only 8 pages long, so it doesn't take very long to read. I strongly suggest you go and read the whole thing if you want to know more about this. But they put this table in at the beginning where they show the churn risk of players after 3 matches with a set of different outcomes. And it's really, really interesting what they found. So, if players lost 3 games in a row, they had a 5.1% churn risk. So there's a 5% chance that they would just stop playing the game after their 3rd loss in a row, which is quite high. Like, for relative sake, for comparison's sake, that's a very high churn risk. If they won 2 games and then they lost, they also had quite a high churn risk of 4.9%. So, you feel like you're on a winning streak, but then you lose a game. A fair amount of people would just stop playing there and sort of call it quits. Then if you draw, then lost a couple of games, you lost a game, won a game, then lost a game, or lost a game, drawed a game, then lost a game. So lots of these different situations, you had similarly high churn risk of 4.6 to 4.7%. So that's immediately quite interesting that you could lose a game, win a game, then lose another game, and you would still have a similar risk of stopping playing the game as to if you just lost 3 games in a row. Now it gets even more interesting that if you won 3 games in a row, you had a churn risk of 3.7%. So considerably lower than if you had lost 3 games in a row, but still surprisingly high. A lot of people, if they're winning 3 games in a row, were quitting playing, maybe because they just felt like the game was too easy. They weren't being challenged enough, so they were just like, yeah, I'm going to stop playing. They actually had a lower churn risk, so less chance of stopping playing the game, if they, for example, lost 2 games and then won 1, or they lost 1, drew 1, then won 1, they drew, then lost, then they won, or if they just drew 3 times. That all had a churn risk of 2.6 to 2.7% chance. So this tells us that players are more likely to keep on playing if they win after losing a few games, or if they draw some games, basically if they have a mix of draws, losses and wins. They then go on to discuss another couple of interesting points. First of all is that this was 2017, so this was what, 7 years ago now? God, it's 2024. Anyway, this was only 7 years ago, and they were saying that there wasn't a huge amount of research done on how to make skill-based matchmaking work with games where there's more than just one person versus another person. That in team games, particularly in games where there's multiple teams, that there hasn't been a lot of research done, so not a lot is known about the best way to make skill-based matchmaking work. They also said that skill-based matchmaking is normally used because there's an assumption that a game being fairer results in a game being more fun for people. And that's not necessarily always true, because while people had quite a low churn rate if they were drawing all of the time, the paper tries to show that actually some games, in some situations, it's more fun for one player to lose and then another player to win. Overall, between the 2 players, if you kind of did an average of their churn rate, it's lower than if they drew. So their argument is that they could build a system where if drawing was the optimal strategy, then that's what it would be doing. And if sometimes winning and sometimes losing was the optimal strategy to keep a player playing, then it would do that. Whereas skill-based matchmaking would always be going after draws. Now, obviously, we don't need to worry about drawing so much because in Warzone you can't draw. As far as I know, I don't think there's any way to tie a game in Warzone. So that part of it doesn't really apply to us. But it is kind of interesting that their argument is basically pure skill-based matchmaking is only the best solution if draws are possible. If draws aren't possible, then there's got to be a better way of doing it. And that's what they try to do. So their proposed engagement optimized matchmaking system basically looks at each player and tries to work out what is their ideal set of results to have the lowest churn rate. And I think this could be different for every different player. You know, some players will really want to keep on playing if they've lost a lot of games and then they win one. Some players will want to keep on playing if they're winning loads of games. Some players will want to keep on playing if they feel challenged, so maybe they're winning about 50% of their games. In theory, engagement optimized matchmaking would look at those different kind of player behaviors, work out which one you fall into, and then try to put you in games where you're likely to win or lose based on kind of your preferences. Now, some of the smart ones of you who are watching this video will already see a fairly significant problem here. That what if in Warzone everybody wanted to win games all the time? Everyone was more likely to play if they won loads of games. Because in Warzone, say in a solos match, one person is going to win that game and 99 people are going to lose. And that's where this idea of using engagement optimized matchmaking in Warzone breaks down a little bit. So let's talk about how matchmaking actually works in Warzone. So when you press that matchmaking button in Warzone for a particular playlist, the game generally, at least in my experience of playing on weekday mornings when there's probably a low population, the game in about a minute finds 99 other people to play a match of Warzone with you. Now, whereas some games like, I know Fortnite definitely does it, I'm not sure about other battle royales, some games might fill lobbies with bots if the population's low for a particular mode or a particular skill level or time of day or whatever it is. Warzone doesn't do that. It always finds a group of other real players, and more often than not, you'll end up in a lobby that does have 100 players in it. It's fairly rare that it will start with a significantly lower player count. It happens sometimes with some particular modes, but in general, it will manage to find 99 other players in a minute. So let's think about what's happening when you press that matchmaking button. You've pressed it, and then I assume there is a matchmaking server somewhere, like a central one, maybe for your region. There's probably a Europe one, and it will try to get some information about you. So what is your accounts, like who are you, and then maybe it'll test your ping to all of the different servers that are running games of Warzone. I live in the UK, so there's almost definitely one in London, maybe there's another one up north or something like that, and then there's a bunch in Europe. And I think it will look at those servers that I've got a reasonable connection to and see what games are open there right now, what lobbies are trying to fill up right there. And bear in mind, each group of servers can only have so many games running at a time. There is a finite amount of server space. They also only have a finite number of players searching at any one time, and it's trying to find a game for you as quickly as it can, so in about a minute. So it will look at all of the games that are available and see whether you can fit into any of them. Now, it might be at a quiet time of day, or if you're in a region where there's not many players, that in the local server farm for you, the local group of servers for you, there aren't any games filling up right now. So it might make a decision of, do we start a new lobby just for you and then hope that 100 other people will join in the next minute or so that will be able to make a lobby? Or do we start broadening the search and incorporating servers nearby? So for me, that might be the Amsterdam servers, the Paris servers, Brussels, Berlin, somewhere like that. It might start considering those, and you can actually see this in game where it starts increasing your kind of the ping threshold for it, of saying, okay, let's look at servers that have a ping of 40 milliseconds or 90 milliseconds or whatever it is. It will start increasing it, and then eventually it will have a list of all the possible games it could put you in. Or if it really can't find one and the servers have capacity, maybe it'll start up a new game, a new lobby to put you in, just hoping that you'll be able to find enough people on one of those servers. So if you're in that situation, which I find I am pretty commonly, especially on weekday mornings, where it's starting to increase that ping threshold, that means that it just can't find games that are a good fit for you. It can't find games to put you in. So the idea of there being any kind of skill-based matchmaking or engagement optimized matchmaking or whatever it is probably going out of the window at that point, because it's just trying to find a match that you can go into, a game that is starting soon. And the lower the population, whether that's because of the time of day that you're playing or the region that you're playing in, or, just because of the popularity of the game at that particular point, towards the end of a season, it's probably a little bit lower. Towards the end of a year before a new Call of Duty release, it's probably a little bit lower. During those times, it's just struggling to find a game for you which has a reasonable connection. But assuming that it can find some lobbies that it could fit you in, now it's got a choice of what sort of players to group together into each lobby. And that's where we have 3 sort of possible ways of doing matchmaking, as far as I know. If you know of a different way of doing matchmaking, please let me know. So first of all, there's random matchmaking, and I think this is what a lot of people say that they would like in Warzone. There have been games in the past that have done this. If you think of old PC games like the Battlefield games where you would just click on a server that you want to join, that's essentially random matchmaking because anybody could click on that server. That means that the group of people in your game are going to be a random mix of skill levels. This does mean there's going to be lots of variation, that there's probably going to be people in every game who are considerably worse than you or considerably better than you if you are an average player, so you are going to have a lot of variation in firefights, which might be something that people would like. The problem comes from the way that Warzone works as a game. Whereas the engagement optimized matchmaking paper was looking at 1v1 games, Warzone is a 100-player game with essentially 100 separate teams if you're playing in solo. There is 99 people that are going to lose every game and 1 person that's going to win. And as I'm sure you've all seen if you've spectated to the end of games of Warzone solos, often the person that wins will be considerably better than everybody else, and they will be absolutely dominating. So there will be lots and lots of people in the game who have 0 kills, 1 kill, 2 kills, maybe 3 kills, and then there will be a small group of people that have like over 10 kills, and then often there'll be 1 person in the lobby who has like 25 kills or something like that. And that's kind of what you expect to happen with random matchmaking. If you imagine the bell curve of skill level in Warzone, there's going to be a lot of people in the middle of that, a lot of people who are quite average, and if they're fighting against each other, you would expect them to have like a 50-50 chance of winning a gunfight. And then at the lower end, there's some people who maybe have difficulty with the controls, who really don't understand how the game works at all, and they will lose nearly every gunfight. And then you have the people who watch loads of videos about Warzone, they know all of the little tricks, they know all of the little exploits, they know the map really well, they've been playing the game for a very long time. They are very likely to win in any gunfights against the rest of the people. And that means in a game of Warzone, where if there's a completely random dispersal of like skill levels, those players are going to dominate. Those players who are up against people who are not as good at them in each individual gunfight are very likely to win the game. They're very likely to be the people who, at the beginning of the game, win the gunfights on landing, so they can get all of the loot, they can get set up, they can get all of the money, and then as the game goes on, they'll have UAVs, they'll have their loadout set up, and their loadout will be more effective than the loadouts of other people's. They will get more and more advantages as the game goes on, they'll get more information about the game, and they are much more likely to win than anybody else in that lobby. This leads to a situation where if you have random matchmaking, that small group of people who are the best players, the top 1% of players, are going to be winning nearly every single game. And you see this all the time. There's plenty of evidence to back up that this happens quite often in Warzone. Recently, there's been the Christmas limited time mode, where as far as anyone can tell, there is no matchmaking. And players who play Warzone a lot, the people who jumped in that mode as soon as it went live, the people who have been playing for a very long time, are absolutely dominating. I think me and my friends who, I play Warzone a lot, but I'm not particularly good at it. Watch any of my streams and you'll see loads of games where I get like 0 or 1 kill, something like that in a normal game. We were winning about 75% of our matches in that mode because we were up against normal players, and the normal players are the vast majority who are kind of in the middle of that bell curve. Us being just a little bit above them in terms of experience and skill meant that we could absolutely dominate those matches. And it's worth remembering that normal players do make up the vast majority of the population who play Warzone, and if skill-based matchmaking is working, you probably see them very rarely in your games. People like you who are watching videos about Warzone, people like me who make videos about Warzone, and all the people who keep up with the news, keep up with the patch notes, the meta and stuff like that, we're in a tiny minority at the higher levels of the skill level. Whilst within our groups, within our communities, you'll be looking at someone, like Aiden or Diaz Biffle or something like that and saying, you know, oh, they're much better than me. They are, but you're still on the top end of the bell curve. Just because you play the game, you know more about the game than most people, you're probably above average as a player. Normal people don't watch videos about Warzone. They play it for maybe a couple of hours a week with their friends. And I know lots of people refer to them as kind of casuals, as if it's some kind of derogatory thing. They're not. They're the people playing the game probably as it's intended to be played. We're the weird ones for being this obsessive about it. But yeah, in a random matchmaking situation, like those limited time modes, those better players, people who play it all the time, they end up completely dominating more matches than not. And you see this a lot if you play games out of peak hours. So like me playing games in the morning, or if you watch content creators who are really good at the game playing off peak hours, they'll be winning game after game after game because they're playing against more normal people. The matchmaking can't work as well because there's just less people on, less people to pick from. So instead it's just kind of grouping together anyone who's got a decent connection with each other in a kind of random way. And they can absolutely dominate their matches. That's how people are able to do things like the Champions Quest, where you have to win 5 games in a row. That shouldn't be possible with something like strict skill-based matchmaking, but with random matchmaking it definitely is, because that top 1% of players is always going to be winning, and the bottom 99% of players is basically never going to be winning any matches. And in my experience, that's not fun for anyone. The people who are losing match after match after match, as the paper showed on engagement optimized matchmaking, are very likely to just quit playing. And then the people who are winning game after game after game are actually quite likely to get bored of it and stop playing, because there's not as much challenge for them. So everybody ends up losing, everybody ends up not having a good time. And this really harms the overall population of the game. Anyone who spent time playing sort of early access battle royales and extraction shooters on PC, those games that have very small audiences, very small populations, will know what happens with these games, where initially everyone's playing it, everyone's having fun, everyone's kind of evenly matched in terms of skill. And then over time, the people at the bottom end of that skill curve, they end up not having as much fun as other people do, and they end up dropping off and stopping playing just because, you know, they're always losing gunfights, they're always losing matches, they don't like the game, so they stop playing, and that shifts the average skill level up a little bit. I actually did a whole video about this, about why Warzone is getting harder. So it moves the average skill up a bit, and then that means more people have fallen behind the average skill level curve, so they stop playing, and all the time the people who are at the top end of the curve, they're playing more, they're getting more experience, they're working out more little exploits, more ways to win, so they're getting better and better at the game. So you see the average skill level of the game get higher and higher and higher, to the point where when a new player wants to come and play the game, they just can't. Like, they come in and they get absolutely destroyed. They don't stand a chance. And then all of the people who are leaving the game aren't coming back either, so the population of the game dwindles. You don't have new people able to crack their way into the game. You don't have current players sticking around because they're all eventually falling behind the curve and then going out. So instead you just end up with this elite hardcore group who really love the game. It's all that they do, it's all that they care about, but the player population's decimated, the game's not making enough money to survive, and it ends up shutting down. And we've seen that happen to countless games over the last few years. So what's the alternative? Skill-based matchmaking. Obviously, it's very hard to define your skill in Warzone. Is it how many kills you get? Is it your average placement? Is it your score per minute? And because Activision don't want people to kind of ruin their own accounts as efficiently as possible to get put in easier lobbies, they don't show us our skill rating. But there probably is some system behind the scenes trying to work out what your skill rating is in Warzone. And I imagine it's probably something similar to the Geeky systems and the True Skill systems that are considering how often you're playing. I definitely seem to get slightly easier matches if I haven't played for a couple of weeks. And it probably uses True Skill to work out, you know, how good are you in a team, how good is your team overall, and things like that. So assuming you're playing at a time where there are lots of lobbies for the matchmaking system to choose from, it will try to find a lobby where the people who are already in that lobby, their average skill rating is as close to yours as possible. Now, because Warzone is a game that has 100 players in a server, you know, it used to be a lot more players, but still 100 players in a server, the chance of finding 100 people who are exactly as good at the game as you are is basically zero. And that's why skill-based matchmaking can sometimes feel a little bit unfair and can sometimes feel a little bit random. if you imagine the bell curve of skill, I love bell curves of skill, I don't know why, I just love that phrase. In a lobby that you're in, so say there's 100 people in the game and you are right in the middle of it. That is the perfect game for you. You're right in the middle of that bell curve. There are going to be some people who are much worse than you in that game. But if you're fairly passive, if you don't go looking for a fight, if you're not doing contracts, bounty contracts and things like that all the time, you're never going to see those players, because those players are going to be the ones that, you know, forget to open their parachutes at the beginning and splat at the beginning. They're going to be the 20 or 30 people that immediately lose their first fights on the ground and then lose their gulags, and so they're out of the game straight away. So instead, you're going to end up coming up and fighting against the people who survive those first fights. They survive the gulag, they manage to pull their parachute on time. And then also, if you're a passive player, you're going to be generally coming up against the people that are looking for you. So the people who are confident enough to do bounties, the people who are confident enough to move around the map and try to find fights. So you're always going to come up against the best people in any lobby that you're in. And this is super easy to test for yourself. Like, if you go into a game of Warzone right now and you just play super passively, you camp a lot, you hide a lot, you will eventually get found by a player who is really good. You will end up coming up against players who have really good movement, they've got meta guns, they'll have high kill counts, they'll absolutely slaughter you. If, however, you go into another game and then you start doing bounties, you start dropping in where you see other players dropping, you'll end up coming across people who aren't very good at the game. I did this today on stream. I managed to find a bunch of people where they missed a load of their shots. They didn't really know what they were doing. They made stupid decisions. It was easy to kill them because I was going out of my way to find players, and that meant I always had a chance that I was going to be coming up against players who were a bit worse than me. Whereas if you don't do that, if you're not super aggressive, you'll only ever see the players who are really good. And I think that always gives people the impression that skill-based matchmaking is really harsh on them, that they get put in really hard lobbies, that they don't have the same sort of lobby streamers do. Because they see streamers running around getting easy kills, and they're like, why doesn't that happen to me? And it's because you're not playing aggressively enough, because you're not finding people. Instead, you're letting people find you. You're only going to be coming up against people who are slightly better than you, even though there is skill-based matchmaking. Now, of course, also, in a skill-based matchmaking system, it must be constantly updating your skill levels, so if you do have some good games in a row, like you've won the 5 games for the Champions Quest, your skill rating will probably have gone up a little bit, and that means the games will get increasingly difficult. And on the other hand, if you have a losing streak, then you will end up coming up against people who are maybe a little bit easier than you're used to, and you will get put into easier lobbies. That is the system working as it's intended. So what about engagement optimized matchmaking in Warzone? How does that work? Well, basically that would be looking at your player profile, trying to work out, okay, what keeps you engaged, what sort of games do you like, and then trying to give you games that work like that. So if you're the sort of player who you really like having a win every 5 or 6 games, maybe the system will artificially lower your skill rating every 5 or 6 games just to keep you playing, just to keep you engaged a little bit. It'll be manipulating your skill rating a little bit just because it knows that you don't like having 10 games in a row that are super hard, or it knows that you don't like having 10 games in a row that are super easy, and instead it will artificially inflate your skill rating every now and then just to give you a little bit of a challenge, just to give you that little bit of a push to want to try and get better maybe. Obviously, compared to what that paper was talking about, this is incredibly hard in Warzone, because whereas lots of people would love to win every other game of Warzone, or more than that, that can't happen because every time somebody wins a game of Warzone, 99 people lose. Every time someone gets a kill in Warzone, another player has died. It's just this kind of zero-sum game where you can't ever have one person being rewarded without other players being punished. So it can't ever be as strong as some people would like to have you believe. It can't hand you a win, and it can't force a loss or anything like that. It can just try to make the games a little bit easier or harder for you, depending on what it thinks will keep you playing. Now, I know there is a lot of nonsense and misinformation out there. I know there was a couple of Dexerto articles where they were talking about patents that Activision had, where the engagement optimized matchmaking was actually based on what you'd bought from the store. I've read all over those patents. Activision have come out and said they haven't actually used them in any games. But even if they have, if you read them, they're all fairly harmless. There are things like maybe you could have a matchmaking system where it encourages people who haven't bought an item to play up against people who have bought an item, where they will see that item being used. Or maybe they could have a system where if you are particularly bad at something in a game, it will offer you some hints to look at a player who is better than you. And there is one patent that does seem to kind of imply it would maybe match up worse players with better players who have also bought things from the store, with the idea being that you would see those players using the things from the store and identify that with being good at the game. Now, I don't think that is something that is being used. Like, they have flat out denied it, which they don't tend to do for other things. There's lots of things that Activision just don't talk about, like skill-based matchmaking in general. But they have said specifically those patents aren't being used for these things. But also, I'm not sure how different it is to something like a Lynx deodorant, or Axe for my American viewers, a deodorant advert implying that you're going to be really successful in romantic relationships if you're using their deodorant. It just seems to be that kind of thing. There's no evidence anywhere for the idea that, oh, if you buy a product, then you will have easier games as a result of that. There doesn't seem to be anything implying that they would reward players in that way in the wording of the patents. And I've also never seen any evidence of the sort of conspiracy theory stuff that people put out that, oh, if you're really good at the game, it will make your guns do less damage, or it will make you have less health, or it will make your auto-aim weaker, or something like that. I've seen people specifically trying to test this on a range of different accounts, you know, having accounts that are really, really high skilled and accounts that are really low skilled, and they couldn't find anything that supported that at all. I think that's just conspiracy theory nonsense. The game is not doing like skill-based aim assist or skill-based or engagement optimized assist damage to your weapons or anything like that. That's just a load of nonsense and people making excuses for why they died. So, how do I think Warzone really groups you up? Now, this is the part where it is just speculation. Activision haven't told us. I'm sure they'll probably release their blog post talking about how it worked as soon as I post this video, which will make me look stupid. But anyway, here goes. I think it does, as I was saying earlier, the matchmaking server will try to find open lobbies that you have a reasonable connection to, and I'm almost certain connection is kind of the #1 priority, because while I'm playing, I never get matched into a different region. I never get matched onto American servers, I never get matched into African servers or Asian servers. I'm always somewhere in Europe, and usually in Western Europe, even if the matchmaking takes a little bit longer. So I'm pretty sure it considers connection above everything else. And then I think it does kind of a balance between how long you've been matchmaking and skill-based matchmaking, and maybe some engagement-optimized matchmaking within that. I think if that's got lots of different lobbies to choose from, then it will try and pick one that fits with your skill rating, and maybe there's some manipulation there that, say, if you've been having a run of bad games, it will lower your skill rating a bit artificially much to try and give you a good game every now and then. And if maybe you've been having lots of games where you've been winning really easily, it might artificially boost your skill rating a little bit temporarily, just to try and give you a bit more of a challenge. I can believe that that's probably happening. But I think, in honesty, most of the time while I'm playing, especially weekday mornings when I tend to stream, I just don't think there's enough games happening at any given moment, and the matchmaking system seems to be so aggressive about managing to get you into a game in about a minute that I think more often than not, we're getting something close to random matchmaking, where there's some protection based on skill, but most of the time you're just getting grouped up with other people who happen to be searching in the same region as you. As an example of that, while I was doing the drone parts Easter egg, where I was literally going into games for the first 2 minutes just looking for drone parts, getting no kills, and then either getting killed or just quitting out of the game. I was doing that for maybe 20 matches in a row, and then the match where I actually ended up completing the Easter egg was won by Broken Machine and Benny Central, who are two UK streamers I know who are incredibly good players, like really, really sort of like top tier players, and they were in the same match as me. And that can only really happen if it was random matchmaking. However, if you're playing at peak times, which is when most normal people would be playing, like when I see people playing like my friends are playing, sometimes, you know, when my wife's playing who doesn't play very much, I can see that some of their games might be easier than my games, and then if I'm watching some streamers playing who I know are really good, and they're playing at peak times, I can see some of their games are much, much harder lobbies than what I would normally get. And I can feel that myself, you know, if I'm playing with people who are much better than me, I'll get in much harder lobbies than I'm used to, and if I'm playing with people who are much worse than me, sometimes we'll get slightly easier lobbies. And I think this is probably the best possible system, that the game is trying to do some engagement optimized matchmaking, some skill-based matchmaking, based on what keeps you playing, what you like doing, what experience you like to have. But more often than not, it can't do that just because it's trying to cope with putting you into a game where you've got a decent connection. That's the game's focus, along with trying to get you into a game quickly, and I think that's pretty good. The only alternative that I can see that would be reasonable would be if you were happy to wait longer for a match, you were happy to, have a 10-minute queue time or a 15-minute queue time to try and get a more accurately skill-based matchmaking game. That could maybe work, and I've seen that happen in other games like Heroes of the Storm and StarCraft, where if you are an outlier, if you are really good at the game, then maybe the matchmaking time will take a lot longer because it's going out of its way to try and find you an accurate match. Or you can be like, oh, okay, I'm going to give up on skill-based matchmaking and just go into the casual playlist where it's just random because I don't want to have to wait so long. But for the final section of this video that is running a little bit longer than I expected it to, let's just quickly talk about some of the common complaints about the matchmaking. So the first one is that you can't play with your friends. The idea being if there's a group of friends where one person is much better than the others, that they can't play together because the lobbies will always be at the skill level of the best friend in the group. Now, I don't see what the alternative is to this, because if, say, it took the worst player in your group and used their skill rating to match you up, then that best player in your group is going to absolutely dominate that lobby. Like I talked about earlier with random matchmaking, the good player is going to end up completely dominating that lobby. And players would abuse this to get easier skill-based matchmaking. They would try to find someone who's not very good to come on their team in quads or something like that, so then they can get high kill counts. And that might be fun for that one player, but then it's going to be miserable for every other player in that lobby. Or if it took an average of the group, it's still going to be a lower average, a lower skill rating than the top player. And as I was saying earlier, it's very easy for a slightly better player to entirely dominate a lobby just by getting those kind of early advantages and winning those early gunfights. So basically what you'd be doing, if you made it so it was either based on the lower skilled group member or just an average of the group, is that you're letting an incredibly good player or a much better player into an easier lobby where they're very likely to dominate and make for a bad experience for everyone else in that lobby. Really, the only fair thing to do is to use the best player's skill rating, and then while other people on their team might not have such a good game, the rest of the lobby will have a fair game. They'll have an okay game. That's going to be absolutely fine for them. So it feels like that's the best possible solution to a bad problem. And to be honest, like Pestily said in one of his recent videos about Tarkov Arena, anything is fun with friends. Throwing rocks at a tree is fun if you're with friends. So if you're playing with a group, you can just kind of expect that if you're of different skill levels, some people are going to have a harder time, and just treat that as a little bit of a challenge. Treat that as something, that's going to be, okay, it's going to be difficult, but you can have a good time with it. There isn't really a better solution to doing the matchmaking around it. And I think most groups of friends will kind of just be okay with it and accept that that's going to be a bit difficult. If your friends don't want to play Warzone with you anymore and you're constantly complaining about skill-based matchmaking, maybe there's another reason they don't want to play with you anymore. The second argument is that you can have one good game and then you can't play for a week because you're up against CDL pros. First of all, this isn't true. I remember when that SBMM Warzone website came out and people could suddenly show the difficulty of the lobbies they were in. People stopped talking about this problem for quite a while because they could see very clearly that you could win a game and the next game wouldn't necessarily be that much harder. Probably because of the things I was talking about earlier, where skill-based matchmaking is actually very difficult in Warzone, and more often than not you're in a kind of random matchmaking situation anyway, or you're in very broad ranges. So you winning a game doesn't make that much difference to your immediate skill rating. It just doesn't seem to happen. I think what's much more likely, and an effect that I've definitely noticed with myself, is that after you win a game, you play worse than the next one. You're a little bit more arrogant, you're a bit more confident, you're taking engagements that you probably shouldn't be taking, you're playing in ways where you're being a little bit less cautious. Also, the adrenaline's gone from your body, so your reaction time might be a little bit slower, and so you're just not playing as well. So the next game feels more difficult, especially if you're starting to do things that maybe worked in the previous game because you were lucky and now you're not lucky because that's just how luck works. then maybe you're going to have a much worse time in the next game. So it feels like the game's punishing you, but really you're just kind of sabotaging yourself. And you can see that teams that don't care so much about winning, teams that are really good and win a lot of the time, they don't seem to have the same problem. The lobbies don't get harder and harder, and that's because they don't let one win affect the way they play. They won one way because they play that way all the time, and then in the next game, they'll still keep playing at that same level because they're not as excited about getting one win or anything like that. And that's how you see people winning things like the Champion's Quest, which, as I said earlier, shouldn't really be possible if skill-based matchmaking would punish you that harshly just because you won one game. And then the final argument that I think is completely untrue is the idea that it prioritizes skill over connection. So lots of people say skill-based matchmaking is bad because it means that you have really laggy games if you're a good player, because, you know, you're trying to be matched up against other good players and there's not as many of you, so it has to reach further afield. I haven't seen evidence of this happening. I watch a lot of players who are incredibly good, and they often have their latency thing up in the top corner, and they don't seem to have a worse connection than me, who I would say I'm maybe slightly above average at Warzone, or my friends who I would say some of them are slightly below average at Warzone because they just hardly ever play it. All of us seem to have fairly similar connections game after game after game. Occasionally you do have laggy games because, you know, the Warzone servers do seem to have a lot of problems, but it doesn't seem to be connected to whether there's skill-based matchmaking going on or not. It's just sometimes the servers are bad and sometimes they're good. I genuinely think that what's happening is the game is prioritizing connection over everything because, as I said earlier, one thing, a bonus about living in Europe is that you can kind of tell what server you're on based on the languages that people are speaking. And it's very rare that my servers are further away than Germany or Italy or Spain. Often I'll hear a lot of German, Italian and Spanish people talking in my servers, but I don't often hear people speaking, say, Eastern European languages, so I don't often hear people speaking like Russian or Ukrainian. I don't often hear people speaking Greek or Turkish, and I don't often hear people speaking like Moroccan, and I don't hear people with American accents or Asian accents or anything like that very often. And that kind of indicates to me that it's prioritizing that connection over basically anything else. The only time I seem to get a really bad connection to a game is when I'm playing with someone on my team who is in a different region. So, you know, if I'm playing with Fireborn, he's hosting and he's in America, then I'll have a bad connection. But that kind of makes sense because it has to kind of choose a server somewhere, and unfortunately there's not a server in the middle of the Atlantic. So, in conclusion, engagement optimized matchmaking isn't as bad as people make out. It's nowhere near as sinister as people make out. Skill-based matchmaking is better than random matchmaking for basically everyone and definitely for the life of the game. And I think a lot of people are kind of making up stuff about it to try and make it seem bad. I don't think the data supports a lot of the criticisms of the systems that we have. It's an incredibly tough problem, and I think we probably have the best solution to it in place right now. So, if you've made it this far into the video, thank you so much for listening and watching all of the way to the end of this. You're absolutely awesome. Let me know in the comments what you think about this. What do you think about the matchmaking in Warzone? Can you think of any ways it could be improved? Can you think of anything that I've missed that I haven't considered in any of this? I know there'll be some people being like, oh, well, all Activision want to do is make money from you. They just want you to play for longer, so you spend more money in the store. And yes, of course they do. They're a business and they're making a free-to-play game. They want you to play for longer and they want you to spend money in the store. I just genuinely think the way they do that is by making you have a good time, which I don't think is all that sinister, to be honest. Anyway, thanks very much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you for the next one. Goodbye.